Oh, that's a nice sync for you. For all the video editors out there. First of all, I know that my age is going to give me a little bit of a different perspective on these devices than someone who actually used them. But my aim in this video is to illustrate kind of where these devices went and why new form factors aren't quite having the same impact on the modern smartphone market. This video might also be a bit of a plea to Andy Rubin to please come back and influence the mobile phone market again. He worked at Apple and then he went on to co-found Danger, the company that produced the Sidekick, and then left to work on Android and create Android before Google bought it. He's like a legend in the mobile phone world, and he's absolutely deserving of the legendary status. To give you a little bit of background on myself, I used to work in mobile phone sales for about 2 years, from 2015 to 2017, but nobody gets into this line of work overnight. So I've been deeply interested in technology since I was a kid. In 2015, I started working at Best Buy, primarily in the mobile phone department. This was during the period of smartphones where everything had largely transitioned away from physical keyboards, and some phones were even coming out without any physical buttons on the touch surfaces, which is what they call the front of these devices. While many of these changes were incremental, it meant that over time, the entire landscape of the mobile phone market changed from the introduction of the first few smartphones to just 10 years later. Sometimes changing for good reasons, like improving waterproofing year over year. Most cell providers in the US also changed the way that they would price these phones, changing from the old 2-year contract with subsidized pricing to the pay-as-you-go monthly installment billing that we have nowadays. This really allowed phone prices to creep up without consumers really noticing, because their monthly bill would only go up like $2 or $3, maybe $5. So it seemed easy to justify these upgrades year over year, every other year. Whereas in the old days, you had to pay huge sums of money, sometimes $400+ up front to get the phone, and then you were locked in with that phone for 2 whole years. So if you didn't like it in the first couple months, you were kind of stuck with it. So let's start by winding back the clock, see what the phone market looked like over the years, see if we can spot a pattern and why these form factors kind of fell out of favor. In the start of the millennia, phones were mostly single-use devices, with a large exception of that rule being the PDA style form factor, which was only recently introduced in something like the BlackBerry 5810, which was the first one apparently to make phone calls. In a market saturated by brick-style devices, the BlackBerry definitely stood out, and it was among the first to really branch out from that regular dialer, keypad, postage stamp screen form factor that most consumers were used to from the 90s into the 2000s. Throughout the 2000s, though, many devices would come and go, pushing many different new form factors. For the first time, having a certain type of phone was a fashion statement. Were you a businessman ready to chime in on a conversation that was sure to increase your net worth? Or were you an instant celebrity whipping out a device that was the showstopper? The first Sidekick ads really leaned into this in their marketing, showing users like flip out the keyboard and onlookers just gawking in interest. Other phones began to experiment with new form factors like the Samsung Alias. It had a unique dual-purpose hinge and keyboard, so it allowed you to use it both horizontally and vertically, and the buttons on the keyboard would change because they had an e-ink display on each and every little keycap. It's really cool technology, and I can't believe that we had it way back then. Now, it wouldn't be a video on 2000s handsets without mentioning the impact that the Motorola Razr had on the US market especially. While the BlackBerry may have been the phone for the businessman, the Razr was the phone for everyone. They may have had limited web functionality compared to something like a Sidekick, but they had an easy to navigate user interface that was great for kids and adults. They also sold like hotcakes. They were the best-selling phone in the US for 4 years in a row. They even overtook Nokia as the top phone manufacturer in the US, which is like a new company coming in and overtaking Apple right now. The Razr was actually my first phone all the way back in 2006, so thanks Mom and Dad for engaging with me in this interest from such a young age. I still have it and my first generation iPhone, so if you want to see a video on that, subscribe so you don't miss it. Now, most of the devices I mentioned used extremely unique operating systems. Some used a design we don't really see much anymore, like the Alias with its kind of pictures to depict what exactly you're clicking on. like a DSLR to show that it's a camera or something like that. Meanwhile, the Sidekick used characters on its main menu. So you would see two people holding a phone, maybe making a phone call. Like when you're selecting the phone app, it's a little different, but I don't know, maybe it has a little charm, I guess. Now the Sidekicks were unique because they relied heavily on always-on web servers that were used to transmit data like text messages, contacts, and even pictures, I think, which sounds a lot like iCloud and Google Cloud nowadays. And it is a lot like that. It's actually way ahead of its time. BlackBerry, on the other hand, relied on layers of security, which made it really great for both businesses and regular users to feel secure using the BlackBerry on the web and to send sensitive information, like I guess a text message. They were apparently really popular with government agencies and stuff like that, which, come to think of it, I guess totally tracks. This security was highlighted during the 2000s Sidekick leak, or leaks, I guess. Multiple celebrities had their Sidekick accounts or Danger accounts hacked. A lot of sensitive information was leaked. Celebrity phone numbers, private pictures, and stuff like that. This sounds a lot like the modern iCloud data leaks, which makes all the more notable that BlackBerry never really had a major scandal like this, which becomes especially noteworthy given that they eventually transitioned to Android, which is the largest platform for malware on mobile devices. In fact, the majority of scandals that plagued BlackBerry in the 2000s were mostly down to their servers being overloaded by high demand from users. This is portrayed really well in the new BlackBerry movie, where the executives are pushing sales to the carriers without really knowing the crucial network details that would lead to the overload. The Sidekick was the first consumer-oriented device with a built-in instant messenger, specifically AOL Instant Messenger, which had a chokehold on the American population in the 2000s. I don't know what else to say. It was iMessage in the 2000s. Everybody had an AOL IM account. Everybody did. I'm sure I even did. Anyway, this paved the way for teenagers to get their first addiction, which was texting. This impact was depicted across various types of media as an easy way for characters or people to convey information to each other without a phone call being necessary. This was coincidentally also a time saved for the viewers of those shows, who ultimately are the consumers who are subtly marketed to by the media that they're watching. Now, obviously the keyboard wasn't the Sidekick's coolest feature that was obvious: the web browser. Full access to the entire web in your pocket in 2003, just like we had in 2023, I think that's a miraculous achievement, actually. In a time where most people didn't even have internet access in their own home, the Sidekick provided it in your pocket. This was, needless to say, revolutionary for the time. And it used a sophisticated relay of servers virtually browsing for the clients that were the phones. This gave users a seamless browsing experience. So I was reading up on this video. I read an article from an ex-Danger employee during the development of the Sidekick, and it sounded like they just took care of a lot of like quality of life things on that phone. I'll put up a quote right now, but basically all you had to do on the web browser was type in Apple to go to apple.com. It didn't make you type in the www or the .com, which I think is just a nice quality of life feature. I wish more smartphones did smart things like that. With the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, the landscape was primed for another shift in user interface design. As Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone on stage, he used some of the devices I've already mentioned as a comparison to the iPhone, showcasing how many buttons they had on the front. He used it as a way to set the iPhone apart by showing it only had one home button on the front. He then goes on to demonstrate multi-touch gestures to an absolutely captivated audience on a screen that very late in production turned into glass.
I can just take my fingers and we call it the pinch. I can bring them closer together or move them further apart to make it bigger or smaller. And so I can just move them further apart and stretch the image. Isn't that cool? And move it around. Isn't that cool?
Now, these crucial design features were groundbreaking for the time, as they hadn't been seen on any other consumer device up until this point. Nearly all touch devices at the time had a plastic screen, used a stylus or some type of touch input that was physically connected to the device to register the touch location. Those displays used a resistive touchscreen, which by definition are only activated by resistance on the screen. Think of like an ATM screen or something like that. Capacitive touchscreens, however, use a transparent electrode layer that responds to conductive material like our body's skin. I think it's difficult to put into words just how captivated the average consumer was by the iPhone. As a kid, I remember seeing the first ads for the iPhone demonstrate some of these touch concepts in a way I've never seen a company effectively do before. Some of the first Android versions or screens lacked some of that multi-touch support, so it made the phone screens feel limited when compared directly alongside the iPhone. Now, I think this is one of the main reasons that mobile devices became very, very similar. Just like how all phones adopted the dialer, keypad, and postage stamp screens in the 90s, every manufacturer seemed eager to innovate and adopt their own version of a touchscreen. And that was especially apparent for phones, which basically unanimously became smartphones. Even though some of the other devices we talked about in this video definitely could have been called smartphones as well. I guess we just didn't have the term for it back then. Some of the last holdouts for the prior touchscreen technology could be ATMs, cars, like for their touchscreen infotainment, the Nintendo DS. If any of you ever used one of those, you remember you really had to push for these screens to register your touch input. Or, surprise, surprise, use a stylus, which was unlike how phones started to be. By introducing the iPhone to the masses were instantly able to tell other touchscreens felt old school in comparison. Mobile devices unanimously adopted capacitive touchscreens in favor of resistive screens of old. They almost all dropped the stylus unless it was for some extra feature or gimmick, and nobody dared to go back to a plastic screen after the iPhone. I take that back. They had plastic screens for a few years after the iPhone, but I dare you to find a plastic screen nowadays. Except for the folding phones. We're going to get to that. As some industry leaders thought the touchscreen was just a fad set to come and go, some of them didn't invest in it and didn't think to invest until it was too little too late. Instead releasing duds like the BlackBerry Storm and I think the Sidekick 4 or 4G, Sidekick ID, I don't know, it's one of them. These models were further plagued by underperforming software and generally underpowered devices, even for the time. The first BlackBerry and Sidekick models look dramatically different from their later predecessors. Then we look at the iPhone and you really can only see the difference on the sides and the back of the device, at least for the first few years. This is the incremental change that would emerge as a pattern in the phone industry. Some Android phones carried on the tradition of having interesting and cool designs, but started to conform eventually as manufacturers settled in on similar components and design features like identical camera units and non-removable batteries, simplifying the growing global supply chain while also cementing sub-manufacturers like Corning, Qualcomm, Foxconn, and Samsung, just to name a few, as industry giants. To give you a little fun fact, the first 2 iPhones at least were powered by Samsung-produced processors. So, we've seen the introduction of a couple new form factors since the modern smartphone design has really been cemented. Primarily, these are of the folding variety rather than having a sliding mechanism, and few have ventured back to the tactility of a physical keyboard. These folding screens and folding devices, however, have some clear disadvantages to their non-folding counterparts, which make the switch that much harder for consumers who are generally used to pretty robust devices at this point. The delicacy in which you have to care, I don't know if I'm using that word right, the delicacy in which you have to care for these devices is a huge turnoff for some consumers. Then you have to think about dust resistance and water resistance because these phones are not water or sometimes dust resistant either. These devices have had a more difficult time swaying consumers than compared to the switch from physical buttons to a touchscreen. So, I think in this video I've painted a pretty accurate portrayal of the world of phones and the evolution therein. If you have any personal experience with any of these devices, please leave a comment below. I'll be down there liking and responding to them. If you want to see a review of my first generation iPhone and my very first phone, the Motorola Razr, maybe consider subscribing so you don't miss that video when it comes out. Until next time.